Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive. We are so glad you are here with us today because we are, I think, about to embark on a journey that is going to completely challenge your vocabulary.
It definitely is.
I want to start this off with a little word association game. Are you ready?
Yeah, I'm always ready. Let's do it.
Okay. So when I say the word romantic, what is the absolute first image that pops into your head? Don't overthink it, just that, that knee-jerk reaction.
Right. It's pretty instantaneous for me. I think for, 90% of people, maybe more, the answer is standard. I see a candlelit dinner. I see a bouquet of red roses, probably way overpriced because it's February. Maybe I see a scene from a rom-com movie, where two people are running through an airport in the rain to confess their love before the plane takes off.
Exactly. Hearts, flowers, dating apps, grand gestures of affection. That is 100% how we use the word today.
There.
But, and here is where we're going to pull the rug out from under you. That is not what we were talking about today.
Not even close.
Not even a little bit.
No. In fact, if you walked into a university literature department or, a history lecture and used the word romantic in that way, they would probably look at you very, very confused. Because in the context of history and art, Romanticism, and you have to hear the capital R there, has almost nothing to do with buying chocolates.
It's actually about revolution. It's about wild, untamed nature. It's about ghosts, drug-induced hallucinations, and incredibly intense, sometimes terrifying emotion.
I like to describe it this way. It's less about a dinner date and much more about a moody teenager running into the woods during a violent thunderstorm to scream poetry at the sky.
That is the perfect image. I love that. It captures the drama perfectly. So our mission today is to unpack the Romantic Age. We are looking at a very specific period in history, roughly from the late 18th century, so the late 1700s, all the way to the mid-19th century.
And to do this, we have gone through a massive stack of sources. We've got academic journals on poetry, biographies of all the key players, excerpts from the British Library, and a lot of historical context on the major revolutions of the time.
Right, and we're going to use those sources to explore how this group of rebels, and they really were rebels, mostly poets, some novelists, completely changed how we see the world. And I don't just mean how we write books.
No, not at all. I mean how we process our own feelings, how we look at a tree, how we think about human rights. It's fundamental.
It really was a total rewiring of the human consciousness. But to understand the romantic, you have to understand the rebel, because this wasn't just like a style choice. It was a fight. If you want to understand people like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, Byron, you have to understand who they were fighting against.
Right. If the Romantic era is that teenager screaming in the woods, we have to ask the obvious question. Who or what are they running away from?
So let's set that stage. Before the Romantic era, we had a period that's usually called the Age of Reason, or the Enlightenment. This was most of the 1700s. If the Romantic is the rebel, who was the Enlightenment?
The Enlightenment was a strict, middle-aged scientist in a crisp white lab coat. That's the image. The whole vibe of that era was logic, order, scientific categorization, and really, really strict rules. They believed the universe was like a giant, intricate clock.
A clock.
Yeah, and if you could just figure out how all the gears worked, you could solve anything. You could solve poverty. You could solve government. You could solve human nature.
It sounds very safe, very structured.
And very stiff. I mean, in literature, this was the time of poets like Alexander Pope. And poetry back then was like a math equation. It had to be structured, polished, witty, and it was usually written for and about the upper classes. It was about fitting in, having good manners. It was all about the head, not the heart.
And the Romantics looked at this world of pure logic and polite, formal society and just said, I can't breathe.
Exactly that. They felt it was stale. They felt it was totally artificial. They looked at this clockwork universe and basically said, you have explained the rainbow using physics, but in doing so, you have destroyed its magic. They wanted to smash the lab equipment. They just wanted to feel something real, even if that feeling was messy or painful or dangerous.
So the spark for this movement wasn't just boredom with the old ways. It was a reaction to massive, world-shattering changes. The sources tell us that this era was really triggered by two massive earthquakes that shook society to its absolute core. A political earthquake and an economic one.
Right.
Let's start with the political one. 1789, the French Revolution.
You absolutely cannot overstate how much this mattered. This is the defining event for that first generation of these poets. You have to remember the context. For centuries, for 1,000 years, kings and queens ruled by what was called divine right.
The idea being that God put the king on the throne, so you just shut up, paid your taxes, and did what you were told.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, in France, the entire script flips. The people rise up, they storm the Bastille prison, they overthrow the monarchy, and the slogan ringing out across all of Europe is liberty, equality, fraternity.
That must have been electrifying.
Oh, for young poets in England, people like William Wordsworth, it was electric. It wasn't just news, it was like the dawn of a new religion. Wordsworth famously wrote about this time, saying, "Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven."
Very heaven. He really thought the world was being reborn, didn't he? They were the cheerleaders for this new freedom. They thought we were finally going to build a world based on fairness and individual rights instead of old, dusty hierarchy.
But as history tells us, and as our sources detail very, very heavily, the French Revolution did not stay a happy party for long.
No, it turned dark very, very quickly.
It curdled. You got the reign of terror. The guillotine was working overtime in Paris. Thousands and thousands of people were executed. Aristocrats, yes, but also just anyone suspected of disagreeing with the new regime. The champions of liberty became tyrants themselves.
That must have been absolutely shocking for those young poets watching from across the channel in England.
It was traumatizing. I don't think that's too strong a word. They went from absolute pure hope to absolute horror in the space of a few years. And this is a really crucial point for you to grasp. Romanticism is partly a result of this political trauma. Because the political world became so chaotic, so violent, so deeply disappointing, these writers started looking inward.
They retreated. They retreated into their own heads.
Exactly. They basically said, well, if I can't fix the government, I will explore my own soul. If society is ugly and violent, I will go look at nature. They looked to their own emotions and to the hills and the trees for some kind of stability, because the cities, politically speaking, were burning.
Which brings us perfectly to the second earthquake, the Industrial Revolution. While France was exploding politically, England was changing physically.
Visually, England was transforming into something almost unrecognizable. I mean, if you lived in the mid-1700s, you saw green fields, small villages, and a slow pace of life based entirely on the seasons. By the early 1800s, those green fields were being eaten up by smoky cities. You had factories, steam engines, massive urbanization.
The sources describe it as a kind of sensory assault. The air literally turned black with coal smoke. The rivers turned brown with industrial waste. And the silence of the countryside was just replaced by the constant roar and clatter of machines.
And it wasn't just the landscape that changed. It was the people. We talk a lot about the dehumanization of the worker. People were leaving their family farms, where they had some autonomy, to work in these loud, incredibly dangerous factories.
They weren't craftsmen anymore. They weren't artisans. They were just cogs in a machine.
Exactly, that's the phrase. William Blake, one of the early romantics, called these factories dark, satanic mills. The Romantics hated this. They hated the smoke, the noise, the greed, the exploitation. They felt that the machine was literally crushing the human spirit.
So this is really important insight then. When we see Romantic poets writing about beautiful mountains and dancing flowers and quiet lakes, it's not just because they like pretty scenery.
No, it was a form of protest.
Writing about a tree was a way of fighting back against the factory.
Precisely. Nature wasn't just a pretty background anymore. It was a spiritual escape. It was the antidote to the dirty, crowded, soul-crushing city. They were fighting the machine by embracing the organic.
Okay, so we have the setup. We have the rebellion against logic and order, and we have the reaction to these massive political and economic changes. But, you know, Romanticism didn't just appear out of nowhere in 1798. There was a transition period.
Right, it didn't just pop into existence.
And the sources mention a group with possibly the best name in all of literary history, the Graveyard Poets.
Yes. This is the goth phase of the 18th century. It's fantastic. Before the movement went full romantic, there was a group of poets in the mid-1700s, like Thomas Gray, who started shifting the focus of poetry.
And they were called graveyard poets because, well, I assume they wrote about graveyards.
Literally. They wrote about skulls, coffins, death, ruins, and general gloominess. They loved the atmosphere of a dark, spooky cemetery at twilight. But the most famous poem to come out of this, Thomas Gray's Elegy, written in a country churchyard, did something very important philosophically.
And what was that?
Well, up until then, as we said, poetry was usually about kings, heroes, great generals, you know, the big names of history. Gray sits in a humble churchyard full of the graves of poor, illiterate farmers, and he writes about them. He writes about the simple villagers buried in the ground. He dignifies their quiet, unremembered lives.
That seems like a small detail, but in a society that was so obsessed with rank and class, that's actually a huge shift, isn't it? to shift the spotlight from the rich and famous to the common, anonymous person.
It's a huge shift. It paved the way for the Romantics to say, hey, the feelings of a simple shepherd are just as valid and profound as the feelings of a king.
So we have the graveyard poets. We also have to mention two other early rebels who really set the stage, Robert Burns and William Blake. Let's start with Robert Burns, the great Scottish poet.
Burns is absolutely vital because he wrote in the vernacular.
And for our listeners, vernacular just means the language that real people actually speak, right? Not some formal academic language.
Exactly. He didn't try to sound like a fancy London professor or use a bunch of Latin word. He wrote in the Scots dialect. He wrote about farming, drinking whiskey, chasing girls, the life of a mouse in a field. It was raw and authentic and full of life. He proved that you could make high art out of what some considered low culture.
And then there is William Blake. Now, reading through the sources on Blake, it seems like he was operating on a completely different frequency than almost everyone else.
Blake was a singularity, a true visionary, and I don't use that word lightly. He claimed to see angels sitting in the trees on Peckham Rye in London. He saw the ghost of a flea in Druid. He wasn't speaking in metaphors. He truly believed that the spiritual world was more real and more important than the physical one.
And he hated the Industrial Revolution with a burning passion. You mentioned his phrase, dark satanic mills, earlier, but he also gave us another very famous phrase to describe London, mind-forged manacles.
Mind-forged manacles. Such a heavy, clanking metal image.
What did he mean by that? What are manacles forged in the mind?
He meant that the people of London were enslaved. But they weren't just enslaved by their bosses or the factories or the government. They were enslaved by their own minds, by the rules of society, by the strictures of the church, by the state. We build the prison in our own heads by accepting these systems without question. We forge our own chains.
Blake also gave us that famous contrast between the lamb and the tiger.
Right. From his two amazing collections, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, the lamb represents childhood, gentleness, and innocence. It's pure, kind, and safe. But the tiger represents experience. It's dangerous, it's terrifying, but it's also burning bright with this incredible, awesome energy.
Tiger, tiger burning bright in the forests of the night is one of the most famous lines in English poetry.
It is. And he asks the tiger that fundamental question. Did he who made the lamb make thee? It's the ultimate theological problem. How can a loving God create something so gentle and innocent, and also create something so ferocious that it will tear your throat out? Blake doesn't give you an easy answer. He just forces you to look at the sublime beauty of the danger. He's saying you need to understand both sides of existence. The world isn't just nice and safe, it's also fierce and terrifying.
So the ground is prepared. The graveyard poets Burns and Blake have tilled the soil, so to speak. Now we enter the official start of the Romantic movement in England, and it really all starts with a friendship, a bromance, if you will.
The ultimate literary bromance. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge.
These two were inseparable for a while in the late 1790s. They would go on these incredibly long walks in the Lake District. We're talking sometimes walking 20 or 30 miles in a single day, just talking and talking and talking. And out of these walks came a book that changed everything. Lyrical Ballads, published in 1798.
This book is the one. It's often cited as the official beginning of the Romantic Age in Britain. And it wasn't just a random collection of poems. It was a deliberate, planned experiment. They had a mission.
What was the division of labor there? Because they were very, very different writers.
They were. The agreement was this. Wordsworth's job was to take ordinary, everyday things, peasants, flowers, a walk in the woods, a ruined cottage, and make them feel special and magical. He wanted to give the ordinary the charm of novelty.
And Coleridge.
Coleridge's job was the complete reverse. He was to take supernatural things, ghosts, curses, bizarre sea voyages, dreams, and make them feel psychologically real. He wanted to give the impossible a semblance of truth to make you believe it.
I love that balance. One elevates the ordinary, the other grounds the impossible. Let's look at Wordsworth first. He wrote a preface to the second edition of this book that basically served as a manifesto for the whole movement. He had this famous definition of poetry that completely rejected the old Enlightenment style.
Yes, he called poetry the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings.
The spontaneous overflow. That is just so different from the previous era where poetry was like a carefully constructed, very logical math equation.
Exactly. Wordsworth believed that poetry shouldn't be forced or overly intellectualized. It should erupt out of you like a volcano. But he added a key condition, which is really important. He said it is emotion recollected in tranquility.
What does that mean exactly, recollected in tranquility?
It means you don't actually write the poem while you were standing on the cliff screaming at the storm. You experience the powerful feeling then in the moment. But then you go home, you calm down, you sit on your couch, and you remember the feeling. You process it through the lens of memory and imagination.
And the most famous example of this is probably his poem about the daffodils. I wandered lonely as a cloud.
It's the quintessential romantic poem in many ways. You have a lonely walker, the isolated individual. He sees a huge crowd of daffodils dancing in the breeze nature, and the sight of them fills him with joy and lifts his spirits. But the key part of the poem, the part that proves his whole theory, is the very end.
Right, because he's not with the flowers anymore at the end of the poem.
No. He says that later on, when he is lying on his couch at home in a vacant or in pensive mood, the image of the flowers flashes upon his inward eye. And then his heart fills with pleasure and dances with them all over again.
So it's not just about seeing a pretty flower. It's about how the memory of nature can heal you later on. It's like a battery you charge up when you're outdoors, and then you can use that energy when you're stuck inside, feeling down.
Precisely. It's about the healing power of the imagination and memory working together.
Okay, now let's flip to his partner in crime, Coleridge. He wasn't writing about happy dancing flowers. He was writing about an absolute nightmare at sea. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
This is a wild, wild story. It's a psychological horror tale. An old sailor with a crazy, glittering look in his eye stops a guest at a wedding and physically forces him to listen to his tale. And the tale is this. The sailor was on a ship heading to the South Pole, and he shot an albatross, a big white seabird.
Which was a terrible idea, right? A very bad omen.
A terrible idea. In sea lore, the albatross was a bird of good luck, a sign of God's favor. By killing it for no reason at all, just a moment of senseless violence, he brings a supernatural curse down on the entire ship. The wind stops. The sun starts rotting the deck. The crew dies of thirst one by one. Ghost ships appear. It's genuinely terrifying.
But deeper down, it's a story about respect for nature, isn't it?
It is. The ultimate moral is that if you sin against nature, against God's creation, you will be punished and you must atone. The mariner is stuck on this rotting ship, surrounded by these grotesque sea snakes. First, he hates them. He calls them slimy things. But then, in a moment of grace, he looks at them again and sees their strange beauty. He blessed them unaware.
He learns to love the ugly things.
Exactly. And the moment he feels that spontaneous love for all creatures, the albatross that his crewmates had hung around his neck falls off, and he can finally pray again. He has to learn to love all things, both great and small.
Coleridge also gave us Kubla Khan, which has one of the best and most tragic backstory anecdotes in all of literary history.
It really does. So Coleridge was taking laudanum, which is opium mixed with alcohol, which was a very common medicine for dysentery and pain back then. He took some and fell into a drug-induced sleep. And he had this incredibly vivid 200-line dream about a magical pleasure palace built by the Mongol ruler Kubla Khan. He saw it all. He heard the music. He saw the sacred rivers.
He woke up and started furiously writing the poem down. He had all these lines perfectly formed in his head.
And then, disaster. There was a knock at the door. It was a person from Porlock, basically a neighbor or delivery guy stopping by on some mundane business. Coleridge got stuck talking to him for about an hour. And when he went back to his desk, the rest of the poem, the vision, had completely evaporated. Gone forever.
That is just tragic. So we only have a fragment of what it was supposed to be.
It is tragic, but in a way it fits the romantic vibe perfectly. It's a fragment of a dream. It's unfinished. It's mysterious. It shows how fragile the imagination and inspiration can be, how easily the real world can interrupt the world of art.
So that's the first generation. Wordsworth and Coleridge, they were the revolutionaries who kicked it all off. But as they got older, the sources say they got a bit comfortable, a bit conservative. Wordsworth eventually became the poet laureate, which meant he was working for the king he used to criticize.
They did. They became part of the very establishment they had rebelled against. And that brings us to the second generation. These guys, Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and John Keats, came along a bit later. They were younger, they were even more radical, and sadly, they all died very young and tragically.
These are the rock stars of poetry. They lived fast, loved hard, and, as the saying goes, left a beautiful corpse. Let's talk about the biggest celebrity of them all, Lord Byron.
Byron was the first international celebrity in the modern sense of the word. Byromania was a real thing, like Beatlemania. He was famous not just for his poetry, but for his scandalous larger-than-life persona. He was handsome, aristocratic. He had a club foot, which gave him a limp that people somehow thought was sexy, and he cultivated an air of being very dangerous.
So rumors about him were just wild.
And mostly true. He had very public affairs with high society married women. There were persistent rumors of an incestuous affair with his own half-sister. He had massive debts.
Yeah.
And he was brilliantly eccentric. I love the story about his time at Cambridge University.
Oh, this is the one with the pet bear.
Yes. So the university rules explicitly said that students were not allowed to keep dogs in their dormitory rooms. So Byron, being Byron, read the rule book very carefully and realized it said absolutely nothing about bears. So he went out and bought a tame bear and kept it in his room. He even suggested he might apply for a fellowship at the college for the bear.
That is the ultimate rebel move. That's malicious compliance at its finest. But his contribution to literature was much more than just stunts. He created the Byronic hero.
The Byronic hero is a character type he created, most famously in his long poem, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Think of a character who is moody, solitary, rebellious, incredibly intelligent, but is hiding a dark secret or a painful past. He wanders the world, feeling misunderstood by society.
That sounds incredibly familiar. That sounds like Batman, or pretty much every vampire in a teen drama.
Exactly. Edward Cullen from Twilight, Batman, Han Solo, Wolverine from the X-Men, they all have DNA that traces directly back to the Byronic hero. It's that bad boy with a wounded heart archetype that we still find so compelling today.
Byron also wrote Don Juan, which is this massive, sprawling, very funny, epic satire.
And in Don Juan, he actually mocks Wordsworth and Coleridge. He thinks they became boring old men who sold out their revolutionary ideals. Byron was very witty and cynical. He wasn't always as earnest and, weepy as some of the other romantics. He was the cool, sarcastic one.
Next up in this generation is Percy Bysshe Shelley. If Byron was the bad boy celebrity, Shelley was the radical idealist.
Shelley was unbelievably intense. He was kicked out of Oxford University for co-writing and distributing a pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism. In 1811 in England, publicly declaring yourself an atheist was social and professional suicide. But he didn't care. He hated kings, he hated priests, he hated all forms of tyranny.
And he believed in nonviolent protest, right, which was quite a radical idea at the time.
He did. His political essays, like The Mask of Anarchy, actually went on to inspire later leaders like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. But in his poetry, he was all about the overwhelming power of nature to bring about change. His most famous poem is probably Ode to the West Wind.
O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being. What is he asking the wind to do in that poem?
He sees the wind as this powerful dual force. It's a destroyer and a preserver all at once. It blows the dead leaves away, which to him represent the old, corrupt society, the kings and the churches. But it also carries and spreads the seeds that will grow in the spring, and those seeds represent the new revolution. He begs the wind, be thou spirit fierce, my spirit, be thou me. He wants his words to be like that wind, to scatter across the earth and wake up the world.
Shelley also had a very tragic end.
He did. He drowned in a sudden violent storm while sailing his boat, the Don Juan, off the coast of Italy. He was only 29 years old. It said that when they found his body washed ashore days later, he had a book of Keats' poetry in his pocket.
Which leads us perfectly to John Keats, the tragic genius of the group.
Keats is really the heartbreaker of the group for me. He wasn't an aristocrat like Byron or Shelley. He came from a humbler background. His father managed a stable. He was trained not as a poet, but as a surgeon and an apothecary. He dealt with blood and sickness and amputation before he ever turned to writing poetry.
And he was quite literally living on borrowed time.
He was. He had tuberculosis, or consumption as they called it back then. It was a disease that basically ate you from the inside out. He had nursed his brother Tom as he died of it, so when Keats himself started coughing up blood, he knew exactly what was coming for him. He chillingly referred to his life as a posthumous existence. He was writing as if he were already dead.
Because of this death sentence hanging over him, his poetry is incredibly focused on beauty and time. He was obsessed with the idea of how beauty can be eternal, even if life is painfully short.
And he developed this concept he called negative capability. It sounds like a complex business term or something, but it's actually a very beautiful and profound philosophical idea.
So what does it mean? What is negative capability?
Negative capability was Keats' idea that a truly great thinker, a great artist, is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason.
So it's about being okay with not knowing the answer, resisting the urge to solve everything?
Exactly that. The Enlightenment mind wants to categorize everything, label it, solve it, put it in a box. Keats says, no, Just stop. Just exist in the mystery of the beauty. Don't try to dissect the butterfly to understand it. Just look at it and feel the wonder.
And his most famous poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn, explores this idea perfectly. He's standing in a museum, probably the British Museum, looking at an ancient Greek vase with pictures painted on it.
Right, and he sees a picture of two lovers who are just about to kiss. And he has this sad but also beautiful realization. They will never ever kiss. They are frozen in paint for eternity. But there's an upside. They will also never get old. Their love will never fade. The girl will never lose her beauty. The boy will never lose his love. Art is eternal, while life is fleeting and often disappointing.
And that's the poem that ends with those famous and famously confusing lines. Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know.
A line that scholars and critics have been arguing about for 200 years. But essentially, I think he's saying that in a world of sickness and pain and death, the experience of pure beauty is the only thing we can hold on to that feels like an absolute, undeniable truth.
So we have covered the poets, the big names, but the Romantic Age wasn't just about poetry. We absolutely have to talk about the novels. And specifically, we have to talk about the monsters.
Yes, the Gothic novel. This is a huge, huge part of Romanticism. It combined that love of intense emotion with terror, the supernatural, and the sublime. Think old castles, dark dungeons, violent storms, and ghosts.
And the undisputed queen of this genre is Mary Shelley, who was, of course, Percy Shelley's wife. And the story of how she came to write Frankenstein is legendary.
It is the ultimate literary origin story. It was the summer of 1816. Mary, Percy Shelley, and Lord Byron were all hanging out at a villa near Lake Geneva in Switzerland. But the weather was terrible. It rained constantly because a massive volcano had erupted in Indonesia the year before, and it completely messed up the global climate. They called it the year without a summer.
So they were stuck inside, bored, just watching the rain for days on end.
Stuck inside, yeah. So Byron, to liven things up, said, let's each write a ghost story. Mary Shelley struggled for a few days to come up with an idea. And then she had what she called a waking nightmare. She saw a pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. She saw the spark of life jolt into a reanimated corpse. And the idea for Frankenstein was born.
Now, I think most people today think of Frankenstein as a horror movie with a big, green, mumbling monster with bolts in his neck, but the book is so much more. It's deeply romantic and philosophical.
It is. The creature in the book is not a mindless zombie. He's articulate, he's incredibly sensitive, and he loves nature. He learns to speak and read by secretly watching a family in a cottage. He reads classic books. All he wants is love and connection.
But society rejects him purely because he looks scary.
Exactly. It's the ultimate romantic tragedy. The creature is born good and innocent, that innocent child idea we see in Romanticism. But society's cruelty and prejudice turn him into a monster. It's also a powerful warning about science. Victor Frankenstein tries to play God using logic and science, but he creates a disaster because he abandons his creation and refuses to take responsibility for it.
So it's a critique of that Enlightenment scientist we talked about at the very beginning. Science without a heart, without morality, leads to destruction.
Precisely. That's the core message.
Now, on a totally different note, we also have Sir Walter Scott. He wasn't writing about scientific monsters. He was writing about knights and castles and Scottish clans.
Scott basically invented the historical novel as we know it. Before him, history in books was just a dry recitation of dates and facts about kings. Scott wrote the Waverley novels, which were set in the Scottish past. He populated history with living, breathing, fictional characters who interacted with real historical events. He made the past feel romantic and exciting and alive. He's the reason so many of us have a romanticized view of the Scottish Highlands today. The kilts, the clans, the code of honor.
And then there's the great Jane Austen. Now, I have to ask this question. Is Jane Austen a romantic? Because she was writing at the exact same time as all these guys, but her books feel so completely different.
She is the great outlier. She's definitely writing during the Romantic period, but philosophically, she is essentially a realist. In fact, she often makes fun of romantic sensibilities.
She trolls them.
She absolutely trolls them. In her book, Northanger Abbey, the heroine is a young girl who has read way too many Gothic novels. She goes to stay at an old abbey and starts suspecting that her host has murdered his wife, all because she finds an old laundry list in a cabinet. Austen is basically saying, calm down, everyone. Life isn't a dramatic ghost story. She valued sense and reason and social observation. But she did believe in love, just a grounded, realistic love, not the dying on a mountaintop kind.
That's a really good distinction. So we focused heavily on Britain, which is fair since that's where the movement really exploded, but this was a global mood, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It was like a virus of feeling that spread everywhere.
Let's look at Germany for a minute. They had a huge influence on the British Romantics, especially Coleridge.
Germany was crucial. You had the writer Goethe. In 1774, he wrote a book called The Sorrows of Young Werther. It's about a sensitive, passionate young artist who falls in love with a woman he can't have, and because he feels everything so intensely, he eventually commits suicide.
And this book was a massive, massive hit.
It was the Harry Potter of its day. But it had a dark side. It sparked what sociologists now call the Werther effect. Young men across Europe started dressing like the character, in blue coats and yellow vests. And sadly, a number of them imitated his tragic suicide. It showed just how contagious this new cult of feeling was.
And also in Germany, you had the Brothers Grimm.
Yes. They were linguists who went around collecting folk tales. Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, Snow White. This fits perfectly with the romantic interest in the common people, in folklore, and in preserving national culture. They wanted to save the authentic stories of the German peasants before the modern industrial world wiped them all out.
What about France?
In France, you have the giant figure of Victor Hugo. Think the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Again, you see that focus on the outcast, the monster with a beautiful soul, the intense emotion. And in France, the battle between the old classical style and the new romantic style was literal. At the premiere of Hugo's play Hernani in 1830, a riot broke out in the theater.
A riot over a play.
A full-on riot. Fists flying. The young romantics, with their long hair and wild beards, were literally fighting the old powdered wig conservatives in the audience because Hugo dared to break the formal rules of classical theater. They were punching each other over poetry. That's how much this mattered to them. That is passion.
That is absolutely incredible. Finally, let's cross the Atlantic to the USA.
In America, the Romantic movement really took on the flavor of the vast, untamed landscape. You get a darker, more psychological side with Edgar Allan Poe, the gothic horror, the madness, the talking raven. But you also get the transcendentalists like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau.
Thoreau is the guy who went to live in a cabin in the woods, right?
Walden Pond. That is pure, distilled American Romanticism. He left society to go find spiritual truth in nature. He wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life. He took the British Romantic ideas about nature and individualism and applied them to the massive American wilderness.
So we've covered the history, the people, the books, but I want to drill down into a few key concepts to wrap this all up. If you had to summarize the philosophy of Romanticism into, say, 3 big ideas for our listeners to take away, what would they be?
Okay, idea number 1, and maybe the most important, the sublime.
We've used that word a few times now. Can you define it clearly for us?
The sublime is a feeling. It's very distinct from the feeling of beautiful. A flower is beautiful. The small babbling stream is beautiful. It makes you feel nice and peaceful. But a massive thunderstorm, a giant mountain that seems to go up forever, a terrifying waterfall, or the vast, dark ocean at night, that is sublime.
So it's beauty mixed with a sense of fear or danger.
Yes. It makes you feel small and insignificant. It reminds you that there are forces in the universe that are infinitely bigger and more powerful than you are. The Romantics loved this feeling. They chased it. That's why they were always hiking up mountains and standing on dangerous cliffs. They wanted to feel that mixture of awe and terror.
Okay, that's number 1. What's idea number 2?
Idea number 2, the child.
This sounds a bit strange to our modern ears. What did they mean by that?
It means they completely changed how Western society viewed childhood. Before the Romantics, children were often seen as just defective adults or small adults that needed to be trained and civilized as fast as possible. The Romantics completely flipped that. They said the child is actually closer to God and nature than the adult is.
Because society hasn't corrupted them yet. They haven't been taught all the rules and cynicism.
Exactly. Wordsworth famously wrote, "The child is father of the man," meaning that we adults should learn from children, not just teach them. They have an innocence and a capacity for wonder that we lose as we get older and more jaded.
That's a powerful shift. And idea number 3.
Idea number 3, the role of the poet. Shelley made the incredibly bold claim that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world.
That is a very bold claim. I mean, politicians make the laws, not poets.
Shelley would argue that politicians just move the pieces around on the board. But poets and artists are the ones who change how people feel and think. They change the culture. They shape the consciousness of a nation. And eventually, the laws always follow the culture. So in that sense, the poet is the true prophet and the true leader of society.
That is powerful. So let's bring this all home. We started with the idea that Romanticism is just about candlelight dinners, but we've seen it's about so much more.
It was a massive fundamental shift from the head to the heart, from the machine to the garden. It championed the common man, the beauty of the wild, and the absolute central importance of the individual imagination.
And why does this matter today? Why should our listener care about a bunch of poets who died 200 years ago?
Because we are still, in so many ways, living in their world. Every time you feel stressed out by your job and decide to go for a hike in the woods to clear your head, you are being a romantic. Every time you root for the rebel hero in a movie fighting against a cold, logical empire like in Star Wars, you are being a romantic. Every time you trust your gut feeling over a spreadsheet, you're being a romantic.
We are all a little bit romantic, whether we realize it or not.
Exactly. At the end of the day, they won the culture war. We value the individual and the validity of emotion far more than the cold logic they were fighting against.
I want to leave our listeners with a final provocative thought. The Romantics, as we've said, were terrified that the Industrial Revolution, the steam engines, the factories, the technology would crush the human spirit. They thought that technology would kill our imagination.
And today, we are in the middle of a new, even more powerful revolution. Artificial intelligence, smartphones, social media algorithms.
Right. We are surrounded by technology that can write for us, draw for us, even think for us. We are more connected to the machine than ever before in human history. So, were the Romantics right to be worried? Is our technology in danger of crushing our spirit?
It's the big question of our time, isn't it? Do we need a new romantic movement to help us find our humanity again? Maybe it's time to put down the phone, run into the woods, and scream at the sky again.
That is your homework for the week, everyone. Go find a sublime moment. Look at a storm, stare at the ocean, feel small for a minute. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.